Good afternoon, bon après-midi, shalom. My name is Carmel Tanaka, and I am the founder and executive director of JQT Vancouver, a Jewish queer trans nonprofit with the mission to queer Jewish spaces and to Jewify queer spaces. We operate on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we are one of the only Jewish LGBTQ nonprofits in Canada, and we recognize the implications of this responsibility. We humbly thank all the Jewish LGBTQ groups that have come before us as their advocacy for diversity, inclusion, and accessibility have paved the path for JQT to thrive today. Giving credit is important to us, and we didn't get here alone. I hope that you are able to enjoy my presentation and are able to leave with food for thought to take back with you into the worlds that you live, work, and play in. JQT's community has grown from a small group of volunteers in 2018 to officially incorporating in August 2020, complete with an intergenerational working board and programming volunteers known as the JQT Dream Team, including myself. Along the way, we made connections, both within the Jewish community and in the LGBTQ community. And not to put Osmo on the spot here, JQT's first Passover event in 2019, back in the early days. And as with any newly formed group with little to no budget, partnering up with established organizations is the way to go. And one of our most prideful partnerships has been and continues to be with the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC on our joint initiative, On the Record, the BC Jewish Queer and Trans Oral History Project. So the story goes like this. Having just finished collaborating with the museum on the award-winning cross-cultural walking tours, which celebrates Asian and Jewish Heritage Months. That's another hat that I wear. I contacted my contact at the museum and said, hey, are there any LGBTQ archives or content in your archives? And to my surprise, their answer was no. And I said, surely you must have a photograph, a story, something. And they said, why don't you connect with our archivist, Alyssa Rutenberg, and explore the possibility of doing an oral history project. And, up until this point, I hadn't dipped my toes into the world of oral history, so it was a whole new world to me. And after a couple very exciting emails back and forth, we decided to have our first. During this meeting, I received a crash course on what is oral history, got to learn what existing oral history projects the museum already has under their belts, and their preferred demographic of interviewees. So, of course, elders have lived experience to share, and also the museum being province-wide, it was important to have voices of people who live currently in BC or lived in BC at one point. So this meeting was also a great opportunity for the museum to learn more about JQT, our mission. I mean, back then we were still just a group of volunteers. I mean, we're still a group of volunteers, but we're just starting out then. And this really was an example of queering Jewish space and a chance to Jewify queer space as well with whatever we produce. And, for us, it's really important that we amplify the voices of Jewish, queer, and trans folks. And one such way is to help the museum's archives be more complete and inclusive. So we decided to focus on hearing the stories of older Jewish, queer, and trans adults and their lived experiences in BC's Jewish and LGBTQ communities. Because let's face it, Jewish, queer, and trans folks are here. We've always been here and we always will be. So, with granting support from the Jewish Community Foundation and the Waldman Foundation, I was contracted by the museum as the project coordinator to organize and conduct 30 interviews within 1 year. To help us launch, we piloted a focus group of 6 JQT volunteers to review oral history interview questions and receive training on how to conduct and transcribe interviews, As you can see, this was in the before times, before the pandemic hit. And this really was a pivotal learning session for everyone involved. We got training on oral history best practices for JQT, and we were able to give feedback on the museum's standard questionnaire, which required some massaging to fit the LGBTQ demographic we were about to interview. Instead of using mother and father, we used parent 1 and parent 2. And we understood that some people will have come out early in life, while others may have led a straight life, which may have included marriage and children prior to coming out. So we needed to be flexible in how we approached one's timeline. So we got everything ready, and we were about to send out our invitations when the pandemic hit. And not only did we have to figure out how to navigate this new reality as two organizations, but also as individuals. And I mean, there were a lot of unknowns. So Alyssa and I, we went back to the drawing board, and instead of doing house visits for interviews and recording just audio, JQT purchased a Pro Zoom account, which gave us the option to do both video and audio. And we knew that these interviews had the potential to bring up heavy and traumatic pasts. So we did our due diligence to contact Jewish Family Services. They at the time had a COVID hotline that was available in case any of our interviewees needed to speak to someone. And I also consulted a lovely professor at the University of British Columbia to learn more about consent practices, which helped guide our consent forms. And we also reached out to the LGBTQ archives in Toronto, who also helped us with best practices for our volunteers. And I'd like to mention that, the Jewish Museum Archives, at the end of the day, is a community archives. And, we are but a small community. And while we wanted to provide full anonymity, we didn't have the resources to guarantee this. So, people will make the connections of who is who. They might recognize the voice. We thought of many options. We were like, okay, so we'll unlock this interview, say, like 5 years after someone's passing. And we thought if we gave everyone the freedom to do that, it'd be a lot to keep track of, and it would get really complicated very quickly. And, who knows where we're going to be in 5-10 years time. So we wanted to make sure that we kept it simple and opted to interview people who felt comfortable being identified as both Jewish and LGBTQ. And, as a researcher, I struggled with this because that meant we weren't necessarily getting the stories of people who were out. And so I hope that through this project, we might be able to still collect these stories. And so out went the first dozen of invitations by email. And by this point, I'd been working professionally in the Jewish community for a number of years in Victoria on Vancouver Island and also in Vancouver. And I've got ties to the Okanagan. And so, I know a lot of Jewish people and a lot of queer and trans Jews as well. And we were specifically looking for Jewish, queer, and trans people over the age of 65. So, I made this list, and I thought to myself, 30 interviews, no problem. I got this. The truth is, I barely got any responses in that first wave of invitations. And I was so disappointed. I can look back now retroactively, and people simply did not have the spoons to deal with anything extra aside from basic survival. So people were still in shock, and an interview to talk about some of their past, which may or may not bring up fuzzy warm memories, was just simply not in the cards. So I was pretty disappointed because I remember hearing the UBC professor saying that when she was conducting her oral history project with trans seniors, there was a tidal wave of interest. And you see, I had this expectation. So where was my tidal wave? But in the end, our project was delayed by 6 months because of the pandemic, but we did not give up. I sent out a second batch of invitations, the next lot on my list, and I also nudged the first batch too, just to see if they might change their minds. And that's when I started to get responses. Some agreed, some were hum and hawing, some respectfully, politely declined, but thought this was a fantastic project. And I only got a few non-responses. And I said, yeah, this is more like it. I mean, I don't expect that everyone wants to share their story. And so here are some of the reasons for not sharing. So some said it's not the right time. It's not safe unless it's 100% anonymous. Don't like having vulnerable footage out there. Don't want to out anyone who may still be in the closet. Queer and Jewish identities are not a priority. Their connection to both communities are pretty vague. Perceived the interview as a tell-all of all sexual relations. That's not the case. And don't feel Jewish enough. Don't have a story to tell. So, not having a story to tell and not feeling Jewish enough were pretty common reasons. And I can assure you that everyone has a story to tell. And as for the not feeling Jewish enough, you'll see in a minute. We'll explore that in a minute. So I now felt encouraged by the positive responses, and I was starting to get some interviews under my belt. And I wouldn't say I was a rusty interviewer at the beginning, but I was inexperienced, and I was just learning the questions and learning how to form them. I eventually found my rhythm, as Alyssa promised I would, and I got good at knowing which questions to ask, how to ask, when to ask, and most importantly, what not to ask. And due to the sensitive and triggering content being shared by interviewees, it became clear that the interviewers needed specific trauma training. Now, I'm not a therapist. I'm just a queer Jew who wants to collect your story about being a queer Jew, but definitely something important and a lesson learned during this project. So we caught the attention of the Jewish Independent, our local Jewish community newspaper run by the one and only Cynthia Ramsey, who has been covering stories about JQT and marginalized LGBTQ and Jews of color voices in our community for eons. This article titled Recording LGBTQ plus History was the public announcement of our project, and that it's well underway and that we are accepting interview submissions. This was a really proud moment for both JQT and the Jewish Museum. It takes a lot of work leading up to launching a project like this one, let alone doing it. There are a lot of considerations to make, a lot of learnings of how we each work, how we work together, and our rhythms. I'm definitely a go-getter and like to get things done very quickly. I mean, yesterday if I could. And the museum, they've got other projects in addition to the one that we're working on jointly. So, even though this was very much a priority for JQT, I mean, people are not getting any younger. And it's very important to get their stories on record before it's too late. And between the pandemic, I mean, the uncertainty of the future and also funding, it was a miracle that this project was even conducted at all. Eventually, I exhausted all of my professional and personal contacts of LGBTQ Jews in BC over the age of 65, and it was time to start spamming Jewish community newsletters as well as head into the world of social media. Posted callouts in a gazillion queer and trans groups and archive networks on Facebook and Instagram. I must have been really annoying for some groups, but you know what? It worked. We had a lot of lesbian and gay voices, so it was really important to me that we included trans and bisexual voices, and recognized that we would probably need to go below the 65 and over age demographic. We're still on the hunt for people in the north of BC and in the interior, Okanagan. So if you know any Jewish, queer, and trans people of any age who you think would like to participate in this oral history project, please have them get in touch with JQT. We have been really lucky to collect stories from Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, the mainland, and en route to the Rockies. So perhaps with this presentation, we'll be able to add even more geographic regions in our province. And I remember someone who actually did not participate in our interview, said it wasn't the right time, introduced me to a lesbian in Victoria, and that was the beginning of the tidal wave. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. I not only became inundated with requests from people to do interviews, but they were coming in from outside of BC saying, hey, I used to live in BC, I would love to interview. We started to receive volunteer offers to help with the transcribing from people as far as Toronto, Virginia, and Moscow. And that was pretty cool. And we became this neat little virtual crew of 10 volunteers. We've never met one another, but slowly but surely we were starting to chip away at each of the interviews one by one. What else that was really beautiful is I started to match make the volunteers who were transcribing to transcribe interviews where I feel like they could really resonate with what was being said. So whether or not they shared a common city with the person who was being interviewed, or had very similar experiences, sharing the same disappointments of or lack thereof of inclusion in the Jewish community, or feeling quite alienated, whether they had a father who was Jewish and not a mom, so halachically they're not considered Jewish, but grew up Jewish until finding out when they have their bar bat mitzvah or b'nai mitzvah, that they are actually not part of the brethren they are not a member of the tribe. So that causes a lot of identity crisis. And so what I found lovely was to get feedback from our transcribers saying how lovely it was and how meaningful it was to be able to participate in this project. And they learned a lot, and what they were saying really resonated with them. And even though it was a virtual project and still remains a virtual project, it very much is an intergenerational project, because the number of the transcribers are much younger than those who are being interviewed. And so it was this beautiful matchmaking, this shidduching of our volunteers and our interviewees. And I really look forward to this pandemic being over, and all of us being able to meet and connect. So definitely sending out invitations to meet over Zoom in the meantime. And so the interviewees get a chance to meet their transcribers. I think that's going to be a really beautiful experience. And, I'm no longer objective. I've had the chance to now meet everyone, and I now can call a lot of these people my friends, and it's truly wonderful. And there's so much more that we can extract from. We've had some volunteers say, hey, can we help with coding of the interviews? There's a lot of amazing themes that can be pulled here. And so if we had all the resources in the world and if we had funding, then of course we can do more. Right now we are focusing on phase 2, which is our online exhibit. And we are definitely looking for donations and applying for grants. So if anyone listening in is interested in helping to support, you can donate to JQT Vancouver. You can also donate to the Jewish Museum if you need a tax receipt. Every penny counts at this point, and we look forward to getting this out there. And especially, the sooner the better. I really do want the people who we've interviewed to be able to see their stories out there proudly displayed displayed not just on JQT's website, but also on the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC's website, to show that it's time, we're here, and it's safe to share our stories. Being the first project of its kind in BC to document and collect the stories of LGBTQ Jews in the province, the project generated quite a bit of praise, and here are some examples of that. Sign me up! About time. It's an important resource. Thanks again for a truly memorable interview. Thanks for including me. I'm looking forward to being part of the JQT community. It was a screaming delight. I'm reaching out to ask if you need any help with volunteers. Honored to be included. This is a timely project. Kudos to you. Are you still looking for participants? Sounds like you're doing some very interesting work. Love to contribute. Congrats. If it's not too late, I'd like to be interviewed. So happy. Sounds like an incredible project. And I'm still getting emails from, even months later from interviewees who are reflecting on their interviews. I mean, it was a highlight for a lot of them during the pandemic. And, over the course of the interviews, which by the way is phase one, the collecting of the interviews, I began to collect data and assembled it into 4 infographics. And I'm currently in the midst of setting up a timeline of Jewish LGBTQ activity dating as far back as the 1940s until present day. And we are very much looking forward to publishing this information in phase 2 of our project, which is an online exhibit. But first, let's dive into these infographics. So here is our first infographic on the age demographic of interviewees. We interviewed 35 people. So our youngest was 32 and our eldest was 85, and our average age was 63. Of the 35 interviewees, we asked them how do they identify in the LGBTQ world, and they were given the opportunity to identify with as many identities as they wanted. So the majority were lesbian, followed by gay, then bisexual, trans, and queer, followed by a number of other identities, and we acknowledge that this is not a complete list of LGBTQ identities out there. Here, the 35 participants were asked how do they identify in the Jewish community, and this is quite fascinating. So growing up, a lot of them grew up mostly Orthodox and conservative, but by later in life and currently you can see that they no longer practice Orthodoxy. There's significantly less conservatives, more reform, more renewal, and then just a rainbow of other options of how to be Jewish, from spiritual, cultural, pagan, biological, secular, agnostic, atheist, and then of course those who no longer identify as being Jewish. So we really interviewed people on the West Coast in BC. After all, that's what we were trying to go for. But we did have some folks who interviewed in the States who once used to live in BC, and that was great. And it was very important to us in our work that we acknowledge the lands on which we interviewed, and so here is a complete list of all the lands of the First Nations people. So we asked a lot of questions in the interview, and some of the meatier questions happened in the last half of the interview. And this is after you have them warmed up and spilling all of their secrets. Some of the questions that I enjoyed asking the most were, what has been your experience of being LGBTQ in the Jewish community? And the reverse of that, what has been your experience of being Jewish in the LGBTQ community? How do you feel both communities can be more inclusive of LGBTQ Jews? The LGBTQ acceptance has changed a great deal over the decades. How has this affected you in your life? And then to conclude, I would ask, how do you celebrate your Jewish and your LGBTQ identities? What have you learned in life that you would like to share with us? That was a very special one. And I got a hot tip from a journalist to ask one last question, which was, do you have anything else to add? And it was a proud moment when said journalist smiled and laughed because this time it wasn't me being interviewed, but it was them. There's a joke in the Jewish community. You got two Jews, you've got three opinions. So you can imagine we got quite a range of answers to all of these questions. And we are currently sifting through all the interviews. And, it's interesting. I finally am where I wanted to be 1 year ago. I finally have the LGBTQ content that I was looking for. And it's really great because I was able to catch up with Alyssa just this week. And we were planning our next steps. And we're really excited because we're finding really creative ways to show our joint collaboration on our various platforms and to curate based on themes. Again, this queering Jewish space and Jewifying queer space. And we wanted to share a couple teasers, 3 audio clips from 3 different interviews to give you a taste of what to expect at our upcoming exhibit.
One of the things that I've had to learn is to follow my heart, to believe that it is good and true and right. And if it goes against everything that everybody else wants you to do, that doesn't make it bad. It just means it needs to be your heart. I think I'm a good person and I try hard to help others and I try hard to participate in the repair of the world as we should. I try and do, when I can, a mitzvah here and there. And in the true sense of it,
it's a concern that I have of having to go back into the closet as I age. Now, as long as we're living in our home, and as long as at least one of us are able to supervise a caregiver, it's no problem. But if one or both of us are required to go into long-term care, I'd be really concerned, and I am really concerned that, who knows, what does that look like, right? Both as a Jewish person and as a gay person.
So I started with the women on the women's end. And so 7 of them came forward and gave me their blessings. And there's Rabbi at the top of the bridge with a shofar and a scroll. And he blows the shofar. And he opens up his scroll and he proclaims to the world, from now on, my name is, join the tribe of the men. And then he walked me down to the other end where the men were. And we put our arms on each other's shoulders and made a big circle, and we sang Hine Matov.
So as we were going through the project, in addition to developing a timeline of Jewish LGBTQ activity from as early as the 1940s until present day, it was really important that the voices that we were and the stories we were collecting didn't just end in, say, like the 1980s, for instance. I wanted to make sure that we were continuing well into today, so that there was a continuum, a continual timeline. And so this opened up an opportunity to not only interview LGBTQ Jewish elders, but say mothers of queer Jews who came out and how they were advocating for LGBTQ rights in local synagogues. Also Jewish professionals who are working in Jewish organizations or used to work in Jewish organizations, and how they were advocating for the LGBTQ community by creating programs.
And when I think back, when I reflect back, knowing what I know now, it's that it's hard to drive something when A, you're not part of the community. I'm not LGBTQ. And it's hard for parents to get their kids to do anything, especially their adult kids. And I know that it was really frustrating for these parents because they wanted so much for their kids to be involved. What was interesting for me at the time, I mean, my kid came out to me. I didn't know that the time that I was doing this work, that I would be just like those parents with a gay kid, a gay Jewish kid. Personally, I'm so glad I did that work because I learned so much from these parents about how our community was going to fall short for my kid. So when he came out to me, I sort of knew what I needed to do and where I needed to push, and how I could support him to use his voice to create what he needed as a gay Jewish man. And so I thank you and all the others for the work that you've done for making sure that there's space. It's not enough space, there's more work to be done, but there is space, and that didn't used to exist. And thank God for the millennials.
I mean, there's some very interesting stories that we're collecting, and we still want to collect. Just because we've collected 35 interviews doesn't mean that it ends here. And we're very thankful that we have a very generous donation of $500 to continue collecting stories. I mean, it's not a lot of money, but that hopefully that will help us continue to accept any incoming requests, so that we can continue to do this good work. So I just wanted to say that it's been a real honor to be able to collect these stories, and I feel that all 35 of them will forever sit in my heart. It's been such an incredible experience, and one that I will honestly never forget. And, our goal is to not just end at 35. I mean, there's so many more people who are on that list who I want to interview. But we got to start somewhere, and this really was a pilot project, and to know that it brought together so many people and intergenerational LGBTQ Jews in the province and beyond is truly beautiful. And as with many of my community engagement projects, they evolve and they transform into something new. And sure enough, this one did too. So upon hearing consistently from Jewish LGBTQ elders during the interviews, also particularly in the post interviews, I mean, that's where the real juicy stories come out, the ones that are not on the record. By then people feel really comfortable and they spill everything and they tell me everything. And upon hearing experiences of seniors' social isolation, that it predates the pandemic and it's an issue, and it's getting worse both within the Jewish community and beyond. And then this really got to me, hearing of their fears of going back into the closet upon entering senior residential care, especially if they're going into ones that aren't for queer folks. And then also their fears of having to hide their Jewish identity when going into non-Jewish senior residential care. So a lot of these very important issues were coming up. and became very evident that LGBTQ acceptance and person-centered cultural identity in healthcare is very important, and it's very much on the minds of our elders in our community. And it was obvious that JQT needed to do something, and hearing the good work that the Jewish Seniors Alliance is doing, we decided to join forces and launch the JQT Seniors Initiative. And here's a picture of our first meeting with the Jewish Seniors Alliance. This was a great first meeting. So the JQT Seniors Initiative, we are a working group of Jewish, LGBTQ, and seniors healthcare organizations whose mission is to lead an awareness campaign addressing seniors' social isolation in our communities. And while we're still in formation, this initiative has already identified a number of areas that require improvement. Increased collaboration among Jewish, LGBTQ, and seniors healthcare organizations, integrated outreach to seniors, who are affiliated and unaffiliated with Jewish community, and who live independently and who are in senior care. A genuine commitment to organizational learning through mandatory and continual staff training, and the adoption of inclusive, diverse, and accessible board bylaws and internal policies. And be sure to check back on JQT's website and our socials for updates on what's happening with the JQT Seniors Initiative. We have a panel coming up in June, so stay tuned. That will hopefully be with the Louis Breyer as well, which is a senior home and hospital. So how does this all relate to you, fellow lovely humans who are tuning in? This is a workshop after all, so I have some questions that I'd like to pose to you. The questions are, how are you celebrating all of your intersecting identities? Now, this is an interesting one. I mean, I hold many identities. I'm queer, I'm a person of color, I'm a Jew of color, I identify as a woman. I mean, there's many ways to be celebrating one's intersecting identities, and we have, most of us, I believe all of us, have more than one. And it's not just celebrating, it's also learning how to navigate all of our intersecting identities. And sometimes they are in conflict with one another, but it's how to celebrate it so that you can love you and all of you. So for a long time, I used to say I'm half Japanese and half Jewish, and I would say probably in the last couple of years, I said, I'm no longer saying I'm half of something, because I'm not half of something. I'm fully Japanese Canadian, and I'm fully Jewish, and I'm fully queer, and I'm loving the fact that I have all of these identities. How can you queer your local community organizations? So, for example, I gave an example today of how we were queering Jewish space. So we were specifically queering the Jewish Museum. The fact that they didn't have LGBTQ content in their archives, one such way is to put LGBTQ content there, and today there is. So, how are you queering your local community organizations? How are you queering your local spaces? What will inspire you to advocate for more inclusion, diversity, and accessibility among your partner organizations? So it can be very exhausting emotionally. I mean, there's a lot of emotional labor when it comes to this kind of work, but if you have the spoons and the energy to do so. How are you getting that energy to do the work that needs to be done? Someone close to me says, there is bottomless fries. I mean, you can constantly be working, but you also need to make sure that you practice self-care and you set boundaries, because this is a constant initiative to advocate for positive change, for communities to be more open. And you can get very exhausted and burnt out very quickly if you don't listen to yourself. So good to recharge, good to practice self-care. And not that this is a last question by any means, because there's many, many questions that I pose to everyone listening in. But, here I am talking about Jewish, queer, and trans community. I mean, this is a community within a community. So I can only imagine that, a lot of you are part of communities that are within communities, and that adds quite a layer of complexity to everything. So whose voices have you yet to amplify? And this is a very important question, because we so often are focused on the trends of voices to amplify, and yet forget that there are people in our front yard and in our backyard who we have yet to hear from. And it's very important to turn our attention to locally, who do we need to hear from, so that we can make our communities safer and more inclusive and welcoming for everyone. Now, for all of you community leaders tuning in, I pose this question to you. What are your outcomes and timelines to ensure your organizations are more welcoming? I highly recommend that you pause this video and for the next 10 minutes, prepare an outline and record your action items to roll out, say a month from now, 3 months from now, half a year, in 1 year, and 5 years down the road. I hope that was productive and that you have a solid starting point to return to with your respective community leadership teams. It's both easy and hard work. You may have uncomfortable conversations, you may get resistance from staff board, and you may also get great unexpected support too from people you didn't think would be your supporters. And of course, for any challenges you can't figure out internally, that's where you can hire DEI consultants to help facilitate you and your management team make decisions moving forward. And for all of your Jewish LGBTQ needs, JQT Vancouver is here to help. So, my name is Carmel Tanaka, and thank you for tuning in on this Friday afternoon, evening for some of you. To learn more about JQT, an oral history project of BC Jews who are queer and trans, and our Advocacy Seniors Initiative. Together we can improve the lives of our seniors so they may live with dignity, social accessibility, and the freedom to be themselves. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Here is my information. You can get in touch at any time. Carmel at jqtvancouver.ca. You can also visit our website at www.jqtvancouver.ca. And we are on Facebook and Instagram. Our social media handle is at JQT Van. Much appreciation to Capital Pride for including us in their Educate series. We are in very fine company, so be sure to check out the other presentations. Thank you, merci, and Shabbat Shalom.